engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
It is 8 after the hour. I am Erick Erickson, a special edition of Atlanta's Evening News here during the Hannity second hour. I've got in studio with me today at WSB former gubernatorial candidate Clay Tippins, who has been in the headlines a lot lately in local news, having recorded a conversation with the Lieutenant Governor, Casey Cagle, in the process of endorsement talk. Welcome into WSB.
Eric, how you doing?
I'm well. So thanks for joining us here. And what I'd like to do is kind of walk through your conversation, the facts of it, explore why you did it. But before we begin, let me lay out the parameters of specifically, there's a piece of legislation involved in this, school choice legislation that funds state-sponsored scholarships where individuals can give money to a state-sponsored scholarship fund and take a dollar-for-dollar tax credit for the amount of money they've given. And the state set these up. The lieutenant governor has not been a big fan of these in the past, and yet this past year helped push through an expansion of this program, raising the amount of money that can go to these programs. Now, that raises all sorts of questions given his opposition in the past to this school choice program. And so if you will, walk me through your encounter with the lieutenant governor.
Yeah, so, when you lose, the guys that beat you call you and say, will you endorse me?
Mm-hmm.
And I lost the race on May 22nd. And so Casey had reached out and said, I'd like to meet with you and talk about you endorsing me. And I said, sure. And I went to his campaign headquarters a couple of days after the race. And I sat down and, we chitted and chatted about this, that, and the other for a little while. And, we got down to the heart of things.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I'd like you to endorse me. And I said, well, that's me giving you my name. And I said, to do that, then, I got to ask you 3 or 4, hard questions. I got to understand what motives were behind things that I've heard about, or, what the real facts were behind things I heard about. And we went through 3 or 4 things. This is one of them. And, look, obviously what happened, we can get into the, we have a debate about the tactics of it. I'm sure we will before this is done. But, it wasn't an accident I had my phone on. I absolutely turned it on ahead of time with an intention to record the conversation. And so, when we got to the particular topic about the school choice bill and what had happened there, basically I said, you guys have probably heard the tape. I said, help me understand, your side of the story, the facts behind whatever this school choice hoopla was, with Senator Tippins. And, of course, I had heard my uncle's side of it.
Right. Yeah. Now let's back up for the listener. So Lindsey Tippins is the Senate chairman of the Education Committee.
That's right.
And he and the lieutenant governor have in the past largely not supported this particular legislation for the expanding the state-sponsored scholarship program. And this year they were on opposite sides of this. And I know you and I had talked ahead of time that you went during the legislative session to talk to your uncle about the program.
Yeah. When that bill was sitting before his committee, a legislator called me and as actually was, I think, a co-sponsor, if I'm not mistaken, on the other house, and said, hey, there's this bill sitting in Lindsey's committee. And, I can't remember what he said, some drama around it or whatever, what's going on there. I said, I don't know. I've been busy. I've been out on the campaign trail, but I'll call him and see. Mm-hmm. And I called him and, philosophically, I'm for school choice. And so the conversation kind of started with, I understand you're opposing these bills. I'm not trying to tell you you're wrong or lobby on it, but just help me understand why. Because I've kind of observed in my short term hearing this politics thing, there's a lot of people that just talk about without actually stopping to ask the other person, why you come down on this? Where are you coming from? So I basically just said, help me understand where you're coming from. And he kind of went through it and he said, I said, huh. And then, that led into the discussion about the political parameters behind it with what was going on with Casey. Mm-hmm. And that's how I became aware of this. And so, I knew about this thing. I think that was the last week in March.
Right. So this thing was the Walton Family Foundation nationally is a big advocate of school choice programs, and in Georgia of the school scholarship program. And one of their big allies in the state Senate against the lieutenant governor had been then State Senator Hunter Hill, who had left the state Senate. And rumors afoot in the legislature and elsewhere that the Walton Family Foundation was going to make an independent expenditure on his behalf during the primary. And Lieutenant Governor apparently wanted to stop that from happening at a minimum.
Yeah, I mean, when I sat down with Lindsay, whenever this was, called the last week in March, around April 1, I don't remember the exact date. And I said, what's going on? I mean, basically what he said this is legislation, that Casey's backed me on killing in the past. And he said, give me some liberty with the facts here.
Right.
I'm recounting a conversation I had with my uncle, and this is how he recounted it. He basically said, look, Casey called me in and sat down and said, this legislation that, we've killed in the past, this thing's got to get through this time. And I think the conversation was something like, well, why? Because Hunter Hill, is going to get a multi-million-dollar super PAC contribution from the Walton Family Foundation. And if I get this bill passed through, I get it in mine. And, so it's got to happen, period. Mm-hmm. And, if I remember correctly what Lindsay kind of told me, he said, well, look, I'll resign then. I think the day he became the chairman of the Senate Education Committee, I think he basically gave or told Casey, I got a resignation letter in my desk, and we'll just put a date on it whenever, I fall out of step with whatever, but right. I got to do what I think's right. And he basically said, remember, I got my letter ready. Just put today's date on it. We'll call it done. And he said, you can then do whatever you think you need to do, but I can't go along with this. I'd rather be shot for doing what's right and lauded for doing something wrong, because I'm not comfortable with it. Mm-hmm. And so, then basically Casey, I think, said some flavor of, well, I have to tell you what. You just pass whatever you can kind of hold your nose and get by with and feel okay about. And I'll, screw the Walton Family Foundation and their check. Of course, it wasn't screw. It was, literally F them.
Uh-huh.
And so I think, Lindsay had this sort of, this is the guy I've known all these years, kind of getting my back, getting the committee chairman's back. And so he went back, and if I got it correctly, he passed the bill, because you got to have a bill get out of committee, right, to have
Correct.
A platform.
Mm-hmm.
So he, in good faith, passes the bill that he thinks is decent public policy out of his committee. And then he finds out shortly thereafter that there's been an amendment crafted, I think, directly out of Lieutenant Governor's office. And again, I'm going off of kind of what I remember, what I heard secondhand. And, basically, I don't think he got even to see a copy of that thing until sort of the 11th hour, literally sort of thing. And then when that amendment was dropped directly to the floor, it passed amongst the Republican caucus. I think it was 35 for, 1 against, and 1 abstaining. Mm-hmm. And Lindsay was the sole vote opposing.
Right.
And, so that's, like I said, I kind of found that out right then around the last week in March or the first week in April.
So now let's jump forward. You've had this conversation with Senator Tippins, the chairman of the Education Committee, your uncle. Yeah. He tells you these things. And so when you have your conversation with the lieutenant governor and recording the conversation, you bring up this legislation. And how does he recount it? Yeah,
the background was, at the time I asked Lindsay, I said, what are you going to do? Mm-hmm. He said, well, I don't know what to do. He's like, I don't think what happens right. He goes, I think it's wrong. He's like, but it's he said, she said. And he said, any discussion of this right now would look like, if I made an issue over this, it looked like I'm trying to help you in your pursuit for governor against him. My intentions would be twisted as being politically motivated to help my nephew. Right. And I said, yeah, you're right. And I said, this is one of these things, do nothing unless you can prove it. And if you're going to do it, go all in. And don't do it in a moment where it gets caught up in the broader political context. Mm-hmm. And so I'd been sitting on that for 6 weeks. And, there were a lot of things I heard as a candidate that disappointed me with my party. And I'm a conservative. I love my Republican Party. But there were things that I heard like this where I thought, we're better than this. Mm-hmm. This is not what we're about. And not just us, by the way. I think, they're just, in general, you have too much sausage at times. But I love my team. I hold my team to the highest standard possible. And so I just made a kind of commitment to myself. If I won, then I was going to do my best to bring improved transparency and good government. And if I lost, that I was going to do the same thing. I felt like that was my mission. And, I remember the conversation with Lindsay where he said, it's he said, she said.
Right.
So the only way to solve that is, take your tape recorder.
So you took the tape recorder to the lieutenant governor, and your conversation with him has been making headlines ever since. This is Erick Erickson at WSB, a special edition, talking to Clay Tippins about his recording of his conversation with the lieutenant governor. When we come back, what the lieutenant governor didn't say through hearsay to Lindsay Tippins, but what he actually said to Clay Tippins, coming up next. It is 24 after the hour. Erick Erickson here, a special edition of Atlanta's Evening News. Joining me in studio, former gubernatorial candidate Clay Tippins, making headlines for his recording of his conversation with Lieutenant Governor Cagle. Now, Clay, we talked about the lead up to this and the law involved in the Walton Family Foundation, and you confronted the lieutenant governor on the audio. He talks about the Walton Family Foundation and the money. And what did he tell you?
Well, look, I had this conversation with my uncle where he said, look, Casey said his motive was he's got to get the multi-million-dollar contribution away from Hunter Hill into his own super PAC. So that's what I had been told was the backdrop. And I asked Casey about in our conversation. Now, in our you guys have all heard the tape. On the conversation, he says it wasn't to get it into his home. It was just to prevent it from going into Hunter's. Time will tell what the real facts are.
Right.
But that was what he said on the tape.
So he's admitting that one of the reasons he pushed, or the reason he pushed this legislation, is to stop Hunter Hill from getting an independent expenditure to his benefit, which kind of explains why the Cagle campaign strategy. He did go after Hunter Hill pretty aggressively towards the end. Looks like they were a little bit worried about him. But the other thing that I think has really stood out to people in this tape is that the lieutenant governor has made a defense of this sort of a scholarship program this year on the campaign trail and his efforts to improve education, and yet he tells you he thinks it's bad public policy.
Yeah, he said multiple times it's bad public policy. At one point he says, basically, this discussion about would you undo it next year? He says, yes. So it's legislation that he has actively worked to kill in the past. It's legislation that I think some 3 times in our conversation on tape, he says is bad public policy. At one point he says, I can tell you 1,000 different ways why that is. And, he said, again, that, he'd work to undo it going forward. So, if you're a charter school fan, you're a school choice fan out there and you're thinking, okay, well, I'm kind of looked the other way because in this particular case, I might not have liked how he got to the answer. We got to an answer that benefits me. There's also an opinion expressed somewhere of, we'll unwind it next year.
Right. It also just, as an outside observer of this, it raises questions about stopping the Delta tax benefit that he had supported giving them the tax break for sales tax in the past, and this year doesn't over the NRA situation, and it makes you wonder if he gets elected governor, how quickly they get the tax benefit.
Yeah.
I wish those of you at home could see the look on Clay's face right now. Yeah, there's a level of cynicism here now involved.
There's a high level of cynicism. Look, that conversation flowed. Mm-hmm. There was just sort of this is how it is sort of, way about the conversation. And, so I know in a few minutes we'll get into what's the criticism been, what's the feedback on this. Mm-hmm. And there's a school of thought that says, hey, why is anybody surprised? This is just how it is.
I was going to actually
and
ask
there's
you
a lot of
that.
truth
Yeah.
to that. So, yeah, you could take this example and say, what other cases would it apply to? And, the imagination runs wild on that.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is a growing level of cynicism, I think, among the public. Electing candidates who on the campaign trail say one thing and then when they actually govern do the complete opposite. A lot of people feel that way on immigration in the past and Washington and whatnot. But here's a situation where there are a lot of school choice people, and the lieutenant governor worked very hard to assure them he supported them, and then to actually hear the audio where he very clearly doesn't support their position.
Sure. I mean, look, if you think that there's real issues to be dealt with, if you think there's real long-term challenges to be addressed, then at some point, the trust that folks have in their government and their officials matters a lot. And, there's a reason why, in general, elected officials have such a horrible standing with their constituents and why there's such low voter rates, which is people cynically expect this. And this was just a great example of what people don't like about politics and politicians. And, which is not to say that all elected officials are this way, but some are. And when some are, and other people stand by and do nothing, then it makes everyone sort of implicitly responsible for the pathetic outcome.
Right. When we come back, we're going to explore that, the criticisms, the surreptitious recording of the conversation. And the Lieutenant Governor's office has already sent a response in to you. I'll read you their response and the points. Yes, a love letter to Clay Tippins from Lieutenant Governor Casey Cagle, and the feedback from people that is this the right way to expose corruption? We'll explore those issues when we come back. It's 36 after the hour, and according to the temperature gauge in the studio right now, negative 71.2 degrees outside. So bundle up, folks. It's apparently well below freezing outside, according to the thermometer inside the studio right now. Joining me in studio on the special edition of Atlanta's Evening News is former gubernatorial candidate Clay Tippins, who recorded his conversation with the Lieutenant Governor. I have invited the Lieutenant Governor on to be scheduled at a date in the future to respond. I want to ask you, though, about one of the recurring conversations I've gotten from people, including texts from listeners who are listening right now, that they appreciate the exposure of the double standards and hypocrisy, but at the same time, isn't it kind of shady to be recording a private conversation?
Yeah. So, indulge me for a minute, since this is my reputation, right? I've been working like 45 years to build it. I think it's important to separate the why and the how. Mm-hmm. You could question my motives, and you could question the tactics. From a motives perspective, wanting the right thing, wanting transparency, wanting accountability, these are things I've been about my entire life. Those are the reasons I jumped into this race. And, my love of those things, my fight for those things doesn't end just because I lost. So, it's been different things. Hey, this is political. Well, if I want to make political hay out of this, then I'd probably use this during the race, made a purposeful choice to wait, So this is simply about a belief that if you've got the right ideas, which I think our team does, the transparency and trust and accountability in doing what you say carries the day, and it's the most important thing. That's what it was about. So that's what leads you to that moment. Then you say, okay, let's talk about the tactics for a minute. And, I if you don't mind, indulge me for a minute. I remember when I was in officer candidate school, and my roommate was a former enlisted SEAL. He'd been at the Batia Airfield in 1986 in the Panama War. 1989 in the Panama War. And I said, I've really never been in a bad fight. You got anything to teach me? Because I want to be a warrior, right? He said, well, Clay, the first thing you got to decide is, do you want to fight or do you want to kick butt? Of course, he didn't say butt, being a good frog man. I said, he said, you know the difference, right? I only want you to enlighten me. He said, well, fighting is when basically you announce your presence and you say, let's square off here. He's like, kicking butt is when you decide what you're going to do and you go for it as hard as you can. You hit the guy and you just keep going and you never give him a chance. He's like, my suggestion to you is never fight. And, my point with the story is this. I decided that I wanted to do what it took to bring transparency and accountability. And if Casey, there's the adage, character is what you do when no one's looking. So it's his words. It's his recap of the story. Was it lost on me that I was taking on a ton of risk for myself and my family, that it would create, a storm of criticism? Of course I knew all that would happen. So I made a decision this was that important to me. And if you're going to do that, then, you go all in. Mm-hmm. And absolutely, I walked in with intent to film it, tape it. And I thought it through carefully. I thought to myself, this isn't great. I hate these tactics, but, I wish it wasn't to that point. I sat there all throughout this race and hear someone tell me a story about what so-and-so did. And at the end of it, I said, why don't you do anything about it? Why don't you tell anybody? Why don't you accept that? Well, that's just the way it is. It's the way the system is. There's nothing you can do about it. You can't prove it. They're too powerful. Fill in the blank with all these excuses for this is the best we can have. And I just disagree with that. I want better. And I decided that I, for one, was going to do what it took to try to make it better. And if you're going to take on that fight against a very powerful lieutenant governor that, might be the next governor of the state, then once you go all in, you do whatever it takes. In this particular case, that required taping the conversation. Do I like it's what it takes? Of course I don't. I don't tape people. It's not what I do. But that's what was required in this position, and all it did was expose his motives and his intentions as he recapped those.
This is one issue. You said you talked to me about several more issues. Do you have plans to release any more of the audio?
What's the statement that we've learned from our dear president? I don't know. We'll see. It'll be very interesting. We'll just have to see. Look, I walked into that room with the intention of bringing transparency and providing a window into Casey's soul and his motives and his tensions and his behavior. And he made that very easy by, so openly talking about those things. And so I started here for a very reason, which I thought it was an unbelievably clear-cut example.
So the Cagle campaign, while we've been talking, has emailed facts regarding secret recording. And they say Clay reached out to Casey to have a confidential man-to-man conversation about endorsing Casey in the runoff. Casey has said clearly that the words he used during the meeting do not accurately reflect his thoughts on the legislation that he worked to perfect for over a year. And education is an issue that Casey has fought to advance throughout his entire career. Clay expressed that his uncle had hurt feelings. Casey wanted to show compassion for a longtime colleague and understanding of Lindsay's stance on education policy. He's the first to admit his attempt at that failed and came out in a way that doesn't reflect his beliefs or principles. Casey sent out a press release on December 6, 2017, announcing his support for education initiatives such as the legislation in question. Casey led to achieve the following education achievements: equalize funding for public charter schools, increase funding for the student scholarship organizations, fully funded the QBE for the first time in 16 years. And plain and simply, Casey didn't receive financial support due to his position, and the Walton Foundation has said countless times they're not engaged in the governor's race. You want to respond to any of that?
I'm shocked. I'm shocked that he would deny it. I mean, come on. He got caught. He got busted in his own words. And so he's spinning and saying, all these other things. I mean, anybody would expect this. This is how it works. This is not surprising.
I guess to the issue, on his talking point, he sent out a press release December 6, 2017, announcing his support for education initiatives such as the SSO program before the legislative session even started. But he does say in the audio that he thinks it's bad public policy and will hurt public schools.
In 1,000 different ways is his quote. Yeah. And look, his statement was, I beat this. I worked with, I think it was something like, I worked with Lindsay to beat this to a pulp in previous years. So, there was a certain gusto to his, 3-time, it's bad public policy. I did it for politics. I can tell you 1,000 different ways. He said it 3 times. There was a certain gusto to beat this thing to a pulp in years past. So, he gets to say whatever he wants to now, which is, this is where my real heart was, despite what I said all these times. And voters get to decide, what they believe. And thank God they now have a chance to decide. That's the whole thing, right, is that this is the game. Mm-hmm. You say whatever depending on whoever you're with, and everybody says, well, that's how it works. I don't like it. There's nothing to be done about it. So now people get to choose.
Well, this raises a question that I'm actually now even getting through text messages to ask you, but it's come up along the way. I mean, people are saying that Brian Kemp set you up to do this.
Look, so let's kind of go through this. There's 3 options left, right? There's Stacey Abrams, who I think would be horrible for our state.
Mm-hmm.
So I clearly don't want her to be governor. As you would imagine, I probably won't be voting for Casey Cagle on July 24th. So am I going to, have I endorsed Brian Kemp? No, I haven't. Do I want him to be our nominee and be our governor? I do. Both Brian and Casey, sought my endorsement. And that's not unique to me, by the way. I'm sure they did it with Hunter Hill and Michael Williams. I mean, this is how it works. But what I wanted to do was stay in my swim lane. And I, knowing that I intended to do this, I kept all of my activities core on this and, kind of cut off any discussions with Brian. And, that's what it is.
But the Kemp campaign did not coordinate with you in advance to
No, to the contrary. Like, I was having a conversation. Like I said, I'm sure myself and every other vanquished candidate was having some flavor of this conversation. And I told Brian, I said, why don't we put any discussion on ice for a while on who I'm going to support in this runoff? I said, I intend to do something. And, you'll probably figure out when I do it. And I said, I'm not sure you want my endorsement after that. Mm-hmm. And I said, but it's something I'm going to do out of conviction from the heart. And I said, between now and then, let's just stop the conversation. And, if you want my endorsement after that, and if you think that's helpful to you, and if that fits into what I'm trying to accomplish here, then we can have that discussion. But I cut that off entirely, and he was fine with that, and I'm sure he understands why that is.
I'm sitting here chuckling, and not at you. A friend of mine who is a Cagle supporter has now texted at least 17 times, just over and over, release the tape, release the tape, release the tape.
Be careful what you wish for.
But, do that. You've mentioned that this is a fight you feel you've got to win. And so I would expect that if there's a there, we are running up into the July period. We've got the election coming out at the end of July. If this is a fight you feel you have to win, I mean, frankly, you're taking on a potential governor of a state, and given your business, I'm sitting here getting attacks on you and your character while we're sitting here talking from folks close to the Cagle camp.
Absolutely. But, look, if you look through what the reaction's been, I've done a couple things, right? I served in the service, I served in business. And so, you learn how to do risk calculations, casualty calculations in advance. And I kind of thought through what's likely to happen. I knew there's a chance that, Casey would still win. But I figured regardless of how it turns out, I kind of factored in to be one for one. For one, everyone attaboy, glad what you did is what it takes to make a difference against this stuff. There'd be one, you're the worst person to ever walk the face of the earth sort of thing. And it's actually been encouraging. It's been more like 15 or 20 to 1 positive. Now, let's talk about the ones. There's 2 or 3 different flavors of the people that think it's awful. One is there's the people that are Casey supporters. Again, shocked. There's lobbyists shocked that they wouldn't, want how the sausage is made, brought to light and exposed. There's people that say, well, it's horrible what, he did. It's horrible, your methods. That's a fair discussion, by the way. It's a fair discussion in my mind to say, thank God it was exposed, but gosh, I don't like how it was exposed. And then there's other people who are very dear to me, basically said, what have you done? You poked a hornet's nest. He may still be the governor. You're going to be his number one enemy, and by extension, me. There's like this. When you do something like this, you are putting on the firing line the people around you. One point in our conversation, Casey said himself, there's going to be a memory. That's how these things work. Mm-hmm. So I fully expect that if you are someone that has invested heavily in Casey Cagle's campaign, and that you've known Casey for a long time and then proceed to support his campaign, that, this is not what you want to see happen. You think that, I'm horrible for what I did. That's okay. That's really okay.
When we come back, we'll wrap up the conversation. Erick Erickson in with Clay Tippins for Atlanta's Evening News. And what about his family and the toll on them with the pressure building over this tape? It is Erick Erickson here on WSB. Coming up, the president signs an executive order rescinding the separation of families at the border. The White House already saying they expect a lawsuit. I'll bring you the latest on that. Right now, though, a couple more minutes here in studio, joined by Clay Tippins, who recorded the lieutenant governor, recounting that conversation. Clay, this has got to be stress on your family. I know my political stands have in the past come back on my family, people approaching them in the grocery store, friends upset. I'm sure your family's dealt with this as well.
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch. There's the old expression, you find out who your friends are.
Yeah.
It's mixed, right? I mean, there's been people that we've known and loved for a long time that have basically called and said, I'm so proud of Clay. There's people who we've known and loved for a long time, said, I can't believe he did it. There's people that, we don't know. They're just the outpouring. Again, it's been a 15 to 20 to 1 positive. Mm-hmm. So that's been encouraging. I feel like we did something right. But when there's been couple, 3 people that we love, that were critical or question the methods and the tactics, and I get that. And that's hard. You don't want to have hard feelings with people you love.
Right.
But that's one side of the ledger. The other side of the ledger is just I think we're all proud. I mean, look, we jumped into the race as a family because we believed I was called to do it. God gets to decide whether people win or lose, but we did it for the right reasons. Felt like you're called to do it. And this was really core to why we ran as a family and put ourselves forward, and this felt like the right, important fight to take on. And so I think my wife and my children are proud. You know what I mean? The other thing, too, it's really been interesting gut check for me as a father because, you tell your kids, stand up to bullies and, don't look the other way when someone does something wrong, stand up for what's right. You go through all these lessons, and they're pretty theoretical,
Yes, they are.
because your kids have never seen you at a lunchroom.
Mm-hmm.
But then all of a sudden, my children are getting a front row seat to watching, my wife and I make decisions that are big-time calls, hard calls with real ramifications downstream. And I think they've gotten to see how we make those, and they get to see us trying to live what we think is our values. And so I think there's been a closeness that brought. I think there's a pride that comes with going through something as a family you think's right.
Clay Tippins, thanks very much for joining us in studio today to talk about this.